Hey, so welcome everyone. My name is Matt and I manage Rhodes Scholars virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture with Matt. So these lectures are free and available to Rhodes Scholar participants as well as anyone who loves to learn, so spread the word. This virtual program is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can, even those who do not have the physical ability or financial means to travel, or leave their homes to join us on a program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of participants just like you who have funded this project from the beginning, so please consider making a donation to Not-for-Profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the virtual classroom and beyond. So please visit rhodesscholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. Okay, so Rhodes Scholar is headquartered in Boston, but we have offices and staff around the world. Today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Matthew Palczynski. So Matt is a frequent speaker on our virtual series, and he is an art historian and consultant who believes that art-related experiences can teach us a lot about ourselves and the world around us. He's based in Palo Alto, California, and gives presentations at museums, universities, and organizations around the world, including Stanford, Microsoft, the Wharton School, and the Barnes Foundation. And he also is a featured speaker on a Rhodes Scholar program, a transatlantic voyage aboard the Queen Mary II, and a transatlantic voyage adventure, London and New York City on the Queen Mary II. So before we begin, a few quick notes. So Matt will present for approximately 35 minutes, and after which we will host a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. Now during the session, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. And then afterwards, I will read as many questions as I can for Matt to respond. We have about 15 minutes for that session. Should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, don't worry. We'll be adding a recording of the lecture in about a week to our online virtual lecture library. And finally, at the end of the presentation, you will receive a survey. And just like on any Rhodes Scholar program, we ask that you take a few moments to fill it out. It will help us grow and improve our virtual lecture series. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. It is so nice to be here. We don't have hours and hours and hours to talk about one of the most important artists really ever, but certainly in the modern canon. We do have a nice chunk of 40 minutes, and that will give us enough time to hit some of the highlights and talk about some of the moments in his life and his career. Some of you know that Van Gogh is an artist who made quite a bit of work in a short amount of time. Some of you are probably very familiar with parts of his biography. And the reason is that Van Gogh is a household name. And when artists or their work arrive at that level, we start seeing films and biographies all putting together a mythology that's passed down from generation to generation. So we all feel like we know maybe something about him. But today we are going to do our best to dig in and see some different moments of his career and in his life, beginning here in his boyhood. He's born in 1853. So if you're doing the math, always look at the dates on the screen, 64. It's hard to link the date with the work when we're looking at the work of a 10-year-old, because maybe we don't assume that we're looking at the work of a 10-year-old. But indeed, here we are, very precocious young boy, upper middle class family in the Netherlands. His mother's from a prosperous family in The Hague, and so the biographies and the stories and the anecdotes and indeed the mythologies tell us that his mother's presence in the home was one of structure, was one of didacticism, was one of top-down, sort of bourgeois leaning in those days, pushed order, pushed comforts, things like this. And you might start to wonder how this will affect the young boy in the household or how it will affect Van Gogh later on. Father was a minister of Dutch Reformed Church. So we've got authority coming from mom, we've got authority coming from dad, and young Vincent will not be the son that follows all the rules coming down from the top, be it from his own familial situation to any kind of artistic hierarchy. I want to mention here in his boyhood that he's named after his paternal grandfather and after a stillborn that was born to the family exactly a year before his birth. That should be part of the story. Imagine growing up and your name is Jane, let's say, and your whole life you heard that we named you Jane after another Jane that came only just before you, only a year before you. So that's definitely part of the story, part of the psyche, part of the identity construction. But we don't want to read too much into it. None of us knew him. We only have the data, and we can make some conclusions about that data as we run through. What I'm interested in is the personality of this young boy at this moment, and that will help us determine why he's making the art that he's doing. All accounts say he's serious and thoughtful, reclusive, self-conscious, suspicious even. We're looking at his earliest known drawing, and we're not seeing figures. The first thing on Van Gogh's mind is not how do I render socialization? How do I render psychology? How do I render communication, nonverbal or otherwise? But instead what he's choosing is the world around him. Barn, farmhouse, perhaps indicates an interest in architecture early on. We will see this interest develop throughout his career, but tellingly no people. Tellingly, he is alone as an observer looking at the world in front of him, and it is this that you want to take through an analysis of his career. Here we're about 17 to 20 years old, still in the early part of his career. Again, look at those dates. 1853 is the birth year, so again, 17 to 20 years old. Now we see some figures, but the figures in the front of the drawing, meaning closest to us at the bottom part of the drawing, are going on with their daily activities. We don't get a sense from this drawing that there's very much interaction between those figures and the artist. Again, we see the artist a bit distanced, off on the side, perhaps on the other side of the park or across the sidewalk, looking over at the figures and, of course, architecture in the background. And here is the building in the background that's quoted in the back of the drawing. In July 1869, Van Gogh's uncle gets him a job in The Hague. Remember, his mother's from The Hague. He's got family connections there. He begins working for an art dealership, and it's a good time for him. He's starting to assert his identity, his individuality, and he's got a bit more money. 17 to 20, he is moving and shaking and breaking into the world. That's 69 when he's first in The Hague. In 1873, he moves over to London to work for the dealer, stays in Paris a few days. And so in these early years, he's here, there, and everywhere. We shouldn't read every date here. We don't really need to, nor will we go through it. But look at all of the places he's digging into in the early years. The Hague, and then he's over to London, France, UK, back to France, back to UK, back to the Netherlands. This is a young person who is unsure. He doesn't know what he wants to do, where he wants to do it. And this is someone who is going off and trying to find that. Not just following what mom and dad say, but trying to find out his own journey. We're into now 1881, still in the early phase, 28 years old. We're jumping in the beginning, and you'll notice when we get to the end that we'll go month to month to month, because in the later years he paints much more quickly, and those works are the canonical works. These are early works that reveal something about him, something about his interest. At around 28 years old, we start to see Van Gogh's earliest known paintings. Here, one of three still lives, objects on tables, meant to communicate the brevity of life. Sometimes in still lives, we see fruits and foods, things that will go bad, like we will, and we have a built-in mirror, a built-in metaphor. We like these paintings, especially because they show things from our world, don't they? Pipes and hats and things. They are extensions of our world, frozen moments in time, snapshots, if you will. And they have a long, long history in the Netherlands, especially. We think of the Netherlands, certainly after the Protestant Reformation, beginning with Martin Luther's declaration in 1517, as being a whole different breeding ground for artists. And one of the genres of art, one of the subjects of art that comes out of that is the still life. Rather than showing didactic religious paintings with the religious figures known to so many people at that day, instead you could do something like this. It appeals more broadly to more people of different faiths. It says something about our own world and about quietly observing the things around us, even the little things around us that don't seem to have much interest. 1883, 30 years old. We're now starting to make a pathway to Van Gogh's signature work. We think of his career as being one in which an artist explores the world around, but also explores nature, and explores nature very closely and from almost a very solemn perspective. Here, he's standing in the fields, beautiful bulb fields of the Netherlands, watching a figure working his or her way through those fields. But again, as we've seen, and we're only a few images in here, Van Gogh's interest is now, it's becoming pretty clear, and we didn't take a lot of time to establish this. His interest is in nature, the architecture forming the backdrop of that, and occasionally in figuration in the early years. He will keep these pie pieces, say, third interest in nature and so on, a third interest in architecture and figuration, all the way through his career. He'll add new themes, he'll change the ratios. But it's clear in the very early days, he likes to stand out in nature and observe it very carefully. He's still in his wandering phase, his restless phase. He's still coming back home to the Netherlands at different moments. He's going off to Belgium. But he's laying the foundation for the Van Gogh that we'll all come to know and love. Here's one of his early important works. And by important, I mean the kind of work that has generated so much interest from scholars over the years. Scholars today talk about Van Gogh's work. They have for a long, long time. And even canonical textbooks. Some of you took art history before, and you might remember going through all those slides, going through all those images. If you got to the late 19th century section and you had enough time to talk about Van Gogh, this would be one of those paintings. It's usually part of the historiography of Van Gogh's career because it puts a line in the sand, the potato eaters. In a way, a culmination of his early period, using deliberately coarse and, let's say, ugly models in order to overlay this image with moral and even religious implications and connotations. The sense here, in other words, these people are more humble, they're more grounded. Look at the colors of their lives. Not much of color, is there? This is a bit of a rough life. This is the day-to-day. This is hard living. We start to see Van Gogh move away from this, move away from these very serious paintings about humility toward an exploration closer to himself. In other words, he moves away from maybe what he thinks he should be doing, what he's hearing from the family structure, from the society which he lives, and moving toward his own inner voice. And we see this with the shift from April of 85 into a year later, about the same time next year in 86, now into his self-portrait. We start to see how Van Gogh is looking inward, representing that looking inward, not only in portraiture, but also in these psychological gazes that come out. At the right, he stares out at himself, figures out what he looks like, what are his features, but also what his interior is saying and what he wants to represent from that interiority. He's right up there with a Rembrandt or an Alice Neal, a painter very much focused on looking inward and focused on behavior, even thoughts rendered in paint. Let's jump a year later. How different is this, right? Self-portrait, April, June 1887. In mid-March 1886, so right at the time of the picture at the right, Van Gogh moves to Paris, lives with his brother Theo in Paris on the Rue de Laval. It's a very small second-floor apartment. It doesn't have room for an easel, so Van Gogh works at the studio of someone he knows in Paris through Theo's connections. Theo gives him paints, he gives him canvases, supports him, and will do the same all the way through his career. These pictures should look different to you, and you don't need any advanced study in art history to see that. At the right, certainly bringing to Paris those muddied tones of his Netherlandish work, and at the left, an eye-opening, much more colorful, much brighter. Brushwork is now in patches at the left. You can see little images of blue or of green, a bit of blue at the tie, a bit of gray at the shirt, a bit of orange at the hair. He's taking paint directly out, applying it, doing it relatively quickly. He's looking around him. Paris is a very different art world from what he experienced in the Netherlands. And here's the view at the left from Theo's apartment, very much done in this late 19th century forward-thinking artistic style. You might know Impressionism. You certainly might know the images that are associated with that movement, images of city life, images of the new plazas and boulevards and cafes and so on that spring out of Haussmannized Paris. Well, here's another image from that moment of this invigorated Paris. At the right, portrait of Van Gogh by none other than Toulouse-Lautrec, one of the leaders of the vanguard in Paris at that time. Toulouse-Lautrec was very comfortable in what are called café concerts, these late night dance halls, these places where performance is celebrated, spectacle, leisure is celebrated, avant-garde sensibilities, costumes, eroticism, and all around bohemianism. Here we have a link between Van Gogh through Toulouse-Lautrec and others to this quasi-hedonistic underground world of Montparnasse and Montmartre, places like this in Paris that are populated with forward-thinking artists, forward-thinking essayists, philosophers, and so on. It's a new world of art, a new world of what would become modern art that Van Gogh jumps right into. 34 years old, he's in Paris, and it's here that he paints the first of two series of his iconic sunflower works. At the left, a few of them. At the right, a couple more, nice and close. We got a very in-your-face look at these things. Think about that. Think about what it means to paint something like this. It means that you are going very close up to the image. He's encouraging us to do the same. They are still lives in the sense, objects no longer living, left there for an artist's study to get us thinking about life, death, what was once living is no longer, the meditation on life, carpe diem, all these things. But here now we get someone who is no doubt poetically going very close to nature, trying to render its essence. We've all been close to nature. Some of us like ocean waves, some of us like falling leaves, wind, thunder, and the like. Here, this is what Van Gogh is doing. He's feeling that energy of nature and trying to render it. It's in Paris that Van Gogh comes under the spell of what art historians and historians like to call Japanisme, after Japanese influences that take over Paris at the time Van Gogh is there and have been there for a few years. At the left, Van Gogh's work after the Hiroshige, at the right, the Hiroshige. And you will see how different they are. Hiroshige is modeling his work in 2 dimensions, so that everything you see, the tree, the people, the fence, flowers, the background, the foreground, are all just 2D layers, meaning they should feel very flat to you. Not a lot of shadow, not a lot of modeling. Even the shadowing on the tree at the right seems flattened. It's a very traditional Japanese way of building up a 2-dimensional surface. This is not what the Europeans are used to. They don't have this tradition of modeling with 2 dimensions. They have a tradition of modeling in 3 dimensions, coming all the way back to antiquity and working forward, and really codified in the Renaissance in Italy with Brunelleschi's work and with Alberti's treatises. So Van Gogh grows up like most European painters, building images in 3 dimensions. What a shock to the system when suddenly we have artists coming in from Japan and the work of those artists that are building up images with 2D layers. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but truly in the world of the history of art, this changes a lot. When we talk about Japanisme and its enormous influence on artists in Europe, especially artists in France and in Paris, especially those in the avant-garde, we have to go back to a couple points in the story. Commodore Matthew Perry broke into Japan, essentially a society that had been closed for centuries, closed except to some traders here and there from the Netherlands coming in through the port of Nagasaki. But mostly this is a closed society run by powerful feudal lords, the shogunates, regional power. It isn't until the Americans get there, until they sign the Convention of Kanagawa in March 1854, signed under the threat of force, by the way, that we see an end to Japan's isolationist period. We start to see immediately other nations want in on the deal. Here's 4 years later, the treaty with France and Japan. They set up their own rules governing diplomatic exchange, opening of Japanese ports for foreign trade. We think of Edo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Yokohama, places like this. We think of the ability of foreign citizens to now live and trade in port cities, to travel, fixed low import duties, and so on. It's very different. It's a different moment. Japan is opening, and France is loving what it's seeing coming out of Japan. One of the figures responsible for bringing goods, especially artistic goods, over to Paris and flooding the market with them is Godai Tomoatsu, powerful businessman from Satsuma, one of the regional provinces in Japan, son of a samurai. Tomoatsu negotiated the establishment of the French Satsuma Trading Company. So not the French-Japanese trading company, the French trading company with this one individual. Worked with a Frenchman, Charles Montblanc, you know that name maybe, in order to do so. He later becomes the first diplomat credited by the Emperor of Japan. And so it's through people like Tomoatsu that you start to see the roads between Paris and Japan. And so much of the work brought in from Japan got disseminated in Paris in large festivals like this. Certainly the Exposition Universelle, the most important of the day. 15 million viewers came to the Exposition Universelle there. This is the one, of course, that Jules Verne visited, and from there he wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. At the expo, there were about 100 Japanese prints displayed, with the impact being found in collectors becoming interested in this work, merchants, learned societies, department stores, travel books. Suddenly, everyone is very interested in Japanese work. And we start to see this in lots of work. Certainly Monet, you think of Giverny, which is utterly full of Japanese prints. Here, Van Gogh's Bridge at Arles. It has a Japanese influence in terms of the subject, the bridge, a subject you find throughout Japanese printmaking, but also the way that he's rendered the scene. Again, less about making the scene believable in 3 dimensions and more about just layering the scene with image after image after image. It creates a kind of dreamlike place, creates a place where the artist can experiment with color, turn up the blue, turn up the greens, and so on. Dead giveaway that Van Gogh is very much taken in by Japanisme. Orchard in blossom in Arles. You can even see here how, though we've seen him in Paris look very closely to those sunflowers, thinking of their connection to still lives and meditations and so on, here he's outside. He's really connecting in Arles. He's looking at all of these trees and he's feeling a bit of their essence. Again, a quality he would have learned from Japanese art too. Second round of still lives, vase with 12 sunflowers in Arles, and a detail at the right, giving you the almost sculptural quality of these images. Summer of 1888 begins the second series that it becomes amazingly known for. While in Arles that summer, he becomes interested in nighttime scenes, outdoor scenes, a mix of nature and figurative, people doing what they do on boats and out by the water. Here, 2 more lovely nighttime scenes. At the left, the cafe terrace at night, and at the right, the night cafe. Figurative, but more about the scene. Expressing his interest in nature. Look at the sky at the left, how he's dabbed on those paint blobs, if you will, to refer to the celestial bodies. Wherever there is something going on in Van Gogh's paintings, there is, if it's an external scene, an outside scene, always something very exciting happening with nature and the celestial world around him. At the right, we start to see Van Gogh play with distorting perspective. Look at the floor at the right and the pool table's legs, how it all just sort of tips. Look at the brightness of the light. Look at the figures just sort of huddling in the corner. We start to get a deeper Van Gogh here, one more interested in the psychological complexities, certainly found in cafes and in day-to-day life. Enter Paul Gauguin. Here at the right, his picture of Van Gogh painting sunflowers, and it's almost too awkward. Those sunflowers don't look like Van Gogh's. One wonders if that's on purpose. They don't really have the best story, the story between Van Gogh and Gauguin. They met in late 1887. Gauguin had just returned from Martinique. They exchanged paintings. Theo exhibited Gauguin's work in his gallery in Montmartre. You almost wonder, and there is something in the narrative about this, if Gauguin feels that it's necessary to befriend Theo's brother Vincent because he's got a deal going with the art dealer. We don't know if that's true. It's certainly come up. Here is Gauguin about 1885, someone who is, in the next few years leading up to his time with Van Gogh, exploring the possibility of art, especially the possibility of color. Gauguin, very much a colorist. At the right, look what he's done with the yellow. It just washes over the whole scene. Much more interested in grounding his compositions figurally, what those figures are up to, but playing fast and loose with what colors are supposed to be. Very taken by nature, Gauguin. Above man is nature, he wrote. Yet what richness of means to attain an intimate relationship with nature. And it's this that probably forms some of the kinship, both terribly interested in nature. Here are Gauguin's manifesto painting, asking some of the great questions of life. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? He doesn't offer us any answers here, but you can see that he sets all of his complex figural groupings and arrangements in this bounty of nature. In 1891, he goes to Tahiti. This is shortly after his time with Van Gogh. A few years later, 1903, he's in a lot of trouble for publicly criticizing the French colonial government. And on 1903 is not doing well. He's sentenced to 3 months prison for insulting the French colonial governor. He's not doing well health-wise, and he dies from morphine. So that ends the Gauguin story. But when we think of his impact on Van Gogh, that impact is extraordinary. Let's bring back the painting at the left, dedicated to Paul Gauguin. You can see the background, that big wash of one color. He gets that right from Gauguin. And again, at the right, now 2 colors in the back, but still big fields of color, flat areas. What you're looking at the right is a self-portrait with the bandaged ear. And this is a very complicated story because, frankly, we just don't know all the details. Here's what we know. On December 23rd of 1888, so that's only a few months after they start to live together in Arles, Gauguin as Van Gogh's guest. December 23rd, Van Gogh had been drinking absinthe. He was drinking heavily anyway at that time. His teeth were rotting away. He's got the diagnosis of syphilis. Who knows what that's doing to his physical and mental state. And Gauguin, who's not having a good time staying with Van Gogh, tells Van Gogh he's leaving Arles. I don't know what happened. No one really knows what happened. But the next morning, Van Gogh woke up in his bed in a pool of blood, but just about unconscious, with part of the ear gone. There is a story that the night before, Van Gogh takes the ear, wraps it up, brings it to a brothel where he suspects Gauguin to be, and gives it to the proprietor and says, "Give this to Gauguin. Tell him to remember me." So there is something there. That's a really big story. We don't know if Van Gogh did this to himself. There's even a question if Gauguin pulled the knife out and defended himself against maybe an attack from Van Gogh. No one really knows. Van Gogh then goes off to the hospital in Arles, initially both interior and exterior scenes, and eventually recuperates enough. He stays there to get him well enough to then, about 36 years old, to go down to Saint-Remy de Provence. What a beautiful part of the world. Look at that lavender. And at the top right, look at the courtyard where he's in the care of the asylum, for lack of a better word. His brother Theo arranges for 2 small rooms for him, one to live, one to paint. And it's there that he immediately gets to work. It's now May. He's got the injury from December, and he's kneeling down on the ground, nose in those flowers. Look at how lovely this is to have had that experience with the ear, and then to kneel down, I'm assuming, smell the flowers, feel the energy coming off of them. He does this the first week he gets there. It's really an eye-opening for him. Into mid-June, look what he's come up with. Starry night. He looks out the window at his bedroom, and he's very taken by the cypress at the left that he paints, and he's very taken by the celestial bodies just hovering over the beautiful Provençal landscape. The bright moon at the right dominates. You've got Venus at the center left also dominating. It might be inspired by his view from the window at Saint Paul du Moselle Asylum, but it's allowing him to explore the beauty and the wonder of nature from a safe place, from a window, or from the confines of protected care. It's at this moment that another contemporary, Paul Cézanne, is playing with art too. At the left, Cézanne's Mont Sainte-Victoire from 85, and then about 20 years later, the same subject. See how different that is? Breaking up the subject into pieces and patches, making it much more abstract. And if you zoom in on the picture at the right, it becomes clear that Cézanne's goal is not to render the mountain. Cézanne's goal is to paint it. This is not a photograph. This is a place where Cézanne is playing with shapes and color. You can see some of the blue from the mountain coming under the horizon line, and indeed some of the greens and oranges of the town going up to the mountain. This isn't logical, and it's not meant to be logical, because by doing this, Cézanne is declaring that art is not something that has to be linked to the real world. It can be inspired by the real world. Van Gogh's doing very much the same thing. Here, just like Starry Night, more cypresses. We're into late June here, just after Starry Night, and bringing in the clouds, bringing in the landscape. Everything's coming together in this nexus for him. It's at this moment that he curiously returns to a subject from his earlier career. At the right, you'll notice the date 1888 from Arles. Well, while in Saint-Remy, he paints his bedroom 2 times again. And you wonder if this has something to do with Gauguin, thinking back on my time at Arles, thinking back on my experiences with him. Where did I live? What was the room like? It could be, but we start to see him exploring Arles. The few months out, he's gone back to that subject. Here, we're looking at the place where Van Gogh spends his last days. He moves to Auvers-sur-Oise in May 1890, and he will die there late July. Those couple months are really prolific for him. Into July, look at the colors at the left. It's absolutely luxurious. Those blues, those greens, look at the patches on the water, just very meticulously added one by one by one. Look at the boats sitting in the water. Figures are there, but as we've seen, not a primary interest for him. We see this at the right as well, where the figure stands in for humanity. The focus truly on the landscape, on the swirling colors and flowers in the landscape. Which reminds me a lot of Mark Rothko's work, his early work, where he too, a few decades later, working in New York, was more interested in the gestalt of the scene, more interested in everything coming together, and less interested in finishing a figure's face and giving each figure a psychology. The figures more or less disappear. Here, look how closely these two women pass in front of Van Gogh as he's outside, painting, studying, observing nature, maybe kneeling down, maybe dirty with dirt. You get a sense that that might have been a bit of an awkward exchange here. They're so close to the viewer and so close to him, but they don't turn to look at him. They don't really engage, do they? And then we come to July. He's 37 years old. He's suffering from something, certainly syphilis, certainly from ill effects of drinking and absinthe and ill effects of bad dental care, probably also a form of epilepsy that causes what he calls attacks. This is how he refers to these incidents, like the one with Gogh. We know that the consensus now is that he probably had lobe epilepsy that caused and was likely exacerbated by his general ill health. So he's not doing very well in the end. He's 37 years old. And so the story went, on July 27th, shot himself in the chest with a revolver, truly not long after making the painting that you see here, Crows with over the wheat field. The last words from Van Gogh, we know, the sadness will last forever. Theo rushes from Paris to his side. They couldn't get the bullet out, and he died shortly thereafter. Biographers of Van Gogh, especially Naifa and Smith, who are Pulitzer Prize-winning biographers, they argue that there's a new theory, that in fact Van Gogh didn't shoot himself, that he was shot by 16-year-old René Secretin, a summer visitor who taunted him in Auvers-sur-Oise in his last days. We think that maybe Van Gogh protected young René by claiming that the bullet was self-inflicted, welcoming death in this way. His brother Theo believed it was a suicide. Dr. Gachet, who took care of him in these last years, also believed it was a suicide. But we really, truly just don't know. That's one of the great mysteries about Van Gogh. Long history, short amount of time, he's painting amazing works one after another. But I'm sure you, like lots of us, have seen some topics that resonate with you. And let's open those topics up. Let's open the topics up in Q&A, and let's use this as an opportunity to think about what we've seen in relation to maybe what he's seen. Let's think about maybe the role spirituality or nature or even religion play in his work. At one point in the early years, he failed a couple entrance exams to a seminary. His father was certainly very religious. So let's open it up for Q&A and see how we do with some of these topics.
Great, thanks, Matt. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, sir.
So we have a lot of questions, and some of the first questions are questions that you just asked the audience to consider. So the first one is from Judith. Judith says, the Netherlands has a sizable Catholic minority population. Did Van Gogh know any Dutch Catholics? And if he did, what was his opinion of Dutch Catholics?
Judith, this is a great question. And while I or any scholars would love to go back in time and really look at Van Gogh's intimate relationships to make some conclusions, or even look at the people he's around, we just really don't know. You're right that there are Catholics in the Netherlands, and there are a lot of Protestants too. We find that he's pulling spiritual, religious inspiration probably from both. I think where your question is leading, what kind of inspiration did he get from, say, the Netherlandish Catholics, or what kind of back and forth was there? We don't know, but there must have been some. Certainly religion was very much on his mind in the early years.
And then did Van Gogh paint anything overtly religious?
That's a very good question. We see references to religion here and there. There are some oblique references, say the Potato Eaters, where we have a painting about morality, subjects that are, or for him, were definitely linked to religion and linked to spirituality. We think of Van Gogh in this way as like a Bruegel figure, not painting religion per se, or the icons of religion per se, but painting themes that relate to so-called appropriate behavior in terms of the religious discourses. We know that he's hinting around the edges of a lot of religiosity and a lot of religious iconography, but Van Gogh is not one like Gauguin to paint a yellow cross or a yellow Jesus at the moment on the cross. It just isn't really what he's interested in.
Thanks, Matt. So talking about Gauguin, apart from his brother and Gauguin, did he have any other close relationships
That's a really interesting question.
that we know of?
That we know of, yeah. A lot of what we know about his biographies, a biography comes from the biographies about him, from the one just mentioned by Naifa and Smith. That's really the one where you want to go first to explore whether or not there are other connections. He seems to have made lots of small connections throughout life, and a small number of very big connections. Certainly Theo. Gauguin has a big impact on him, but we don't really know the kind of impact Van Gogh had on Gauguin. It reads to me a bit like a one-sided story, let's say. But we do know that it must have been a pretty big relationship, sticking with Gauguin for a second, because years later, after the ear incident, and you can imagine, Gauguin leaves town and thinks this is just nightmarish. But Gauguin mentions Van Gogh and said, he really was able to be honorable and keep his secrets. And it makes you wonder, what's he talking about? What kind of secrets did they have? Were they secrets of the relationship? Were they secrets of the ear incident? We don't know. So that was a great relationship like Theo. But no one else really comes quite to that level, I think, to Theo and Gauguin.
And then following up on that, Stephanie says, why was he so apparently distraught with Gauguin leaving?
Stephanie, you and me both want to know this, and if you can come up with a theory, you'd be very popular. We all want to know this. You can imagine how distraught it would be if you are really taken with someone and you really like someone's work, and through your brother, you get a hold of that person and invite her or him down to paint with you and live with you. This is something that was done in those days, especially among the avant-garde artists. It's an honor, it's a respect to go down and paint with someone, alongside someone, a bit like a mini academy. So when Gauguin left him, that would have felt like a loss. That would have felt like a rejection, maybe. I don't want to project into him, but his letters certainly indicate that it would have been a big loss for him. Why, Stephanie, I don't know. Apart from he was very excited about him being there, he clearly looked up to him. But again, we just don't know the nature of that relationship or what went on.
So we have a few questions about his early life. Susan asks, you mentioned his mother's early influence. Did he have any serious relationships with women? And what was his mother's influence on those?
Two good questions. Women. We know that he's had quasi-serious relationships with women, what we, looking back so long later, might consider quasi-serious relationships. One in particular who had a child who was pregnant with another child. This wasn't Van Gogh's, we don't think. And Van Gogh eventually left her from pressure from the family, and she years later ends up drowning herself. That's the one big relationship of his life. He isn't really going through many relationships with women. What his mother would have thought, that's hard. We just don't know. But knowing a little bit about her social mores, let's say, or certainly her parenting style, or what she encouraged in her son in the letters and what she ignored. We know that if it's something that Van Gogh likes, it's probably going to be something that his mother doesn't like. And so there is a little bit of her involvement in his relationships. But no, he doesn't have many major ones. One quasi-major in the early years, as I said, with someone who has child, but that ends very shortly.
When they're talking about his psychological state, we have a question from Michelle that says, there seems to be speculation on his psychological state. Is that speculation based on his own writings, his artwork, or is it based on contemporary accounts? from his contemporaries?
Thank you, Michelle. So all three, writings, contemporary accounts, the work of art historians and biographers who look into the material, certainly in the pictures and the work, there is pictorial evidence of what he's interested in, where he's looking, where he's going. All of this leads any of us studying this to a series of questions that we ask. And you'll hear me say, you know, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, but here's what's possible. Art history is a bit like that. We base the conclusions we come up with about an artist or about a work on whatever information we have. With Van Gogh, it's a treasure trove. It's much harder to study someone that we really don't know anything about in terms of biography. And it's much, much harder to study the work of someone who didn't write as much as Vincent van Gogh did. He wrote so many letters to his brother Theo, especially, that we don't have to speculate about his mental state. We can just look at exactly what he's written. Today I was really suffering, so I painted this painting. Today I was really overjoyed, so I painted this painting. We don't, in art history, see ourselves as psychologists, and we are very, speaking it for the discourse, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but the whole genre of analyzing anything, art, literature, music, dance, anything like this, you have to be very careful with psychoanalyzing someone, especially someone we didn't know, couldn't have known because they lived so long ago. And we come up very quickly with walls like anachronism. We don't want to apply something from our own time back to his life. We don't want to assume there's anything in that relationship with Gauguin that, you know, might be from our own time, but there was something there. He wrote about it. Lots of people wrote about it, you know, so anything we come up with, we usually have a 2, 3, 4-pronged approach to getting information.
Thanks, Matt. There are a few questions here. Can you confirm that he only sold one painting in his lifetime? And speak more broadly on, was his work commercially popular?
Was his work commercially popular? No, no, zero, right? This is someone who is operating at a time, and to confirm the one painting, yes, this is someone operating at a time where art has moved into a whole new place in Paris, certainly, and in the offshoots of Paris. So, in other words, Van Gogh brings with him the Parisian avant-garde to these places that he goes, Arles and so on. These are small towns. There's not much there artistically, but his stay in Paris exposed him to a whole new moment, a whole new zeitgeist of artists pushing forward and breaking the rules. So when you do that as a community, as an individual, you're not going to be commercially successful right away, if at all, because you're pulling and pushing against the very system that people are used to. So the marketplace is a really interesting topic for Van Gogh, because we think of the tens of millions of dollars and more that these paintings fetch now, but this has very little to do with him and more to do with where we are now in terms of the marketplace and how valuable his work was seen. But no, he was not considered really anything of merit by the status quo at the time.
Well, Matt, I feel like I want to keep asking you questions, but we've run out of time for this morning's session. So thank you very much. And we will be digging deeper into some of the letters, right?
Letters.
In our afternoon session for those of you that signed up for it and paid for that for the afternoon session. So Matt, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that signed up today. And again, if you appreciated what you saw today, please consider making a donation and looking at our virtual campus, which has a host of additional online programs, not just lectures, but multi-day programs, including one to Provence. So Matt, thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. See you in a bit.